Please join me in welcoming Lauren.
Thank you, Jasmine. We're a small but stalwart crowd this morning, and I thank you for coming. And for those who actually haven't made it to the Torf Gallery, as Jasmine noted, this whole series is connected with and celebrates the exhibition Hippie Chic, which is on view in the Torf Gallery just for one more month. And in giving gallery talks of the exhibition, I've been sort of fielding questions, and one of the most popular is actually why we did a show called Hippie Chic. And I think it makes for a nice introduction to this lecture because it kind of encompasses our attitude towards fashion and what we're doing here at the museum, and also as a fashion historian, why we would sort of take up this subject, because the 60s represent a really fascinating era for fashion. There was something clearly going on. Many would say the 60s were this age of revolutions, many revolutions, political, social, cultural, and sartorial as well. As we see this new ideas burgeoning, we have to remember that this was the period that saw the protests against the Vietnam War, the escalating of the civil rights movement. This was the start of the women's movement, the environmental movement, the sexual revolution, all these amazing ideas and these amazing sort of fomenting of challenges to the status quo were coming at this time. And fashion was really at the heart of it all. And what we're going to see is some changes that are going on in fashion. And why we're interested is that the most visible symbol of these new ideas that are percolating in the 1960s become the hippies, these people with their long hair, both men and women, and their outlandish clothes that are sort of quasi-costume-like, really symbolized new ideas that were happening. They also had a very anti-consumer stance. You might even say it's anti-fashion. They rejected sort of corporate culture. They didn't want to be told what to do and how to wear clothes. They rejected Paris and haute couture. They said, I'm going to do my own thing. And they very much strongly said, I'm going to express my own personality and my values in my clothes, and I'm going to make my clothes unique. I'm going to take charge of my own fashion. So those ideas are fascinating to us, and as an art museum, we look at the point at which something you might say is very anti-fashion actually influences mainstream and even high fashion. So you start to see these folks, hippies here. This is a great photograph taken in San Francisco, in Golden Gate Park, of a variety, and you can see the sort of eclectic look. Some of it's you see the man sitting there has sort of an Indian print shirt, and you see someone wearing more of a romantic cape there at the back, and fringe, and various lengths of hair. This look almost immediately had an impact on ready-to-wear designers and even haute couture Paris. So a radical thing is going on. Suddenly things are coming from the street and percolating up. So that point at which it becomes a much more powerful message is where we're really interested in something going on in fashion. So if you think, again, some of these ideas that were percolating, this is a great image of someone wearing, politically flower power meant a lot of the protests against the Vietnam War, but his outfit is very flower power and psychedelic as well, and we're going to look in that. And of course, there on the left, one of the big ideas of this era of youth is to experiment with drugs, and that's going to be really where we start off. But this is where we're leaving. This is a beautiful Avedon photograph from 1956 showing one of his favorite models, Susie Parker, wearing a classic haute couture Christian Dior ball gown. It is everything about the elegance of 1950s fashion and everything that the 60s is going to reject. And this is what we're going to be pushing against as the next generation, and it is again part of the leaders of these new ideas, not only the political struggles, social struggles, and all this other stuff, are going to be young people. This is going to be the generation, the baby boom generation now, this generation that was born maybe during and after World War II, who are suddenly having new ideas about the way they live. They do not want to live or look like their parents. And a lot of these new ideas we see first percolating up in the mod looks. One of the first sort of revolutions in fashion is the mod fashion look. And its chief successful iconic item is, of course, the miniskirt, which you see there. So we're looking at mid-1960s here. And of course, the epicenter of mod fashions is going to be London, which is also a radical thing. It's not going to be Paris haute couture. London is going to start becoming one of the most important fashion centers. It is still today. A lot of that had to do with the post-war Labor Party, which suddenly allowed a lot of people who never would have gone to college or art school suddenly are coming out of art schools, young designers, hip artists, and you see London exploding with boutiques, 1,200, 1,500. They may not have all lasted, but they really tapped into this incredibly exciting excitement, really, that's going on in the streets, and a sense that fashion is fun and that there's a new culture, too, that's getting over the privations of World War II, and they suddenly have money in their pockets and they want to dress and have fun. So you see mod fashions exploding in London, and they had such a vibrant pop scene as well. We're going to digest it. The world is going to feel it through the British invasion, of course, all the pop stars, the Beatles, etc. And there you see in the top left, Twiggy, of course, one of the iconic models of the era, wearing sort of your classic mod miniskirts, and the designer right next to her is Mary Quant, who was one of at the forefront of creating this new look. It was a look that suited young people. Miniskirts and a straight boyish cut was something that is a youth. You need a youthful figure for that. So you see, it's all these young people were sort of wanting to mark themselves as rejecting sort of the grand luxury haute couture of Paris and coming up with something that was youthful and fun and really said something more about the lifestyle that they wanted to live. And here on the right is a wonderful boutique, one of the many boutiques that cropped up in London, especially Carnaby Street, and we'll see King's Road later, were these places of excitement where these crazy boutiques of swinging London were putting out very flashy fashions, and this is dandy fashions, and two very dandy men in front. So London is going to be where we kind of start our story, and of course, a nice way to encapsulate what's going on is here are the Beatles there in 1963, 64, wearing their very cute, their mop-top cute mod suits, matching. This is them by 1967. Clearly, something is going on in fashion. And the Beatles, interestingly, will have a little fashion story of their own when we get to psychedelic fashions. They actually owned a boutique in London called the Apple Boutique, briefly, and it was entirely unsuccessful. But the fact that the Beatles owned and ran a boutique says something about the power of fashion in this time, because it really, what you wore was what you believed in, and you really kind of wore your values on your surface. This is a photograph of Jim Morrison. Not many people know that he actually owned a boutique called Themis in Los Angeles. Again, the importance of fashion as a statement for pop stars and other people was a really salient point in this story. It was actually run by his girlfriend there, the girl with the red hair, Pamela Corson. But it was a total bohemian hangout for people in Los Angeles on the Sunset Strip, as you can see, featuring predominantly ethnic-inspired clothing. But the girl up there on the right, I don't know who it is wearing sort of a very retro style. So you see fashion taking on a whole new dimension, expressing the youth's interest in living and looking in a different fashion from their parents. And this mod style really, the bridge between mod fashions, this new, very futuristic, streamlined, little boyish, almost a 20s revival look, very space-age miniskirts, the bridge between that is going to be psychedelic fashions, and that's going to really open the door to full-blown hippie styles. It's going to, its attitudes was experimental, almost pushed the acceptable bounds of what was fashionable at the time. And you can almost see it, I mean, 1967, which is when Sgt. Pepper's comes out, is the height, sort of the apex of psychedelic styles. And you can see there's the Fab Four in the middle and their effigies right to the left. It has so many messages in it, but not only was Sgt. Pepper's, the album, considered a rather incredibly important concept album where you're even getting psychedelic layering of music. You get one of the first times when there's like sort of taped feedback incorporated into the track. But what they're wearing is sort of fun too, because part of the message of this era was to send up and almost thumb your nose at what the older generation was expected. And the Beatles, in wearing uniforms and doing it in these kind of lurid satins, really wasn't particularly pleasing to an older generation. They making fun of British military uniforms or even wearing vintage military uniforms is not always embraced and considered rather cheeky. So part of this is this tongue-in-cheek kind of send-up of traditional British army uniforms, and also part of this whole wacky kaleidoscope of images that appear on Sgt. Pepper's. Psychedelic fashions are going to embrace commercial graphics and the look and the lurid colors that imitate the drug experience, because taking drugs was one of the things that youth culture did to feel and experience the world in a different way. Or you may be familiar with Timothy Leary, the famous ex-Harvard professor who immortalized the taking of LSD and was promptly fired from Harvard. But his impetus to this was to try to experience the world in an interesting and more heightened way. And you're going to see fashion falling right on the heels of that, where colors and textures are trying to heighten the experience of wearing clothes. In support of Timothy Leary was Ken Kesey and his crazy band, who traveled all the way from California, the Merry Pranksters, all the way from California to Timothy Leary's foundation in New York in this crazy psychedelic painted bus. And after that, a series of experiences where they would celebrate the taking of LSD. So what you start to see in fashion, and here, of course, is one of, these are images from rock concerts at that time, because light shows, this is one of the first times you start to see this kind of lurid, crazy light experimentations at rock concerts. So the experience of bending forms, kaleidoscoping, crazy acid colors, shapes that change and distort, and the colors and the lights is all part of something that's going to be trying to be incorporated into fashion. We also have to remember this is the great era of these trippy psychedelic graphics, commercial art, which actually drew strongly on fine arts. If you think of pop art with its lurid colors and collaging of ideas, and also op art. Very clearly you can see the influence of op art in Victor Moscoso's poster here on the left. This is for a rock concert. And this is a wonderful image by the Japanese artist, graphic artist, Kechi Tanama. It's the Japanese version of the album cover for Jefferson Airplane from 1967. But you can see that fashion is going to incorporate the jarring colors, and it's going to start incorporating that sketchy, loopy, characteristic, trippy style that artists used in commercial graphics. And this is a dress by Hon Amore. She is so not a hippie. She is a very, she showed in Paris and in New York, started showing in the mid-'60s, but she is absolutely aware of psychedelic graphic art. She has incorporated that into this print, where she has this huge, this is a very large scale face that's printed on there in these really shocking, really intense colors. She's not only printed the sheer overdress, but the underdress too. So you get this, I think you can get the feeling here of that mirror and that kind of movement. So it has a little trippy of like a distortion going on when the wearer is moving. And I've added here an image up there so you can see how strongly it connects to a Peter Max, one of the most important sort of psychedelic graphic artists of this era, and his poster of John Lennon from 1969, but very much borrowing from the language of graphics. And I mentioned before the Beatles. Well, this was the Apple Boutique on Baker Street in London. They had come to this by having met this group, and here they are, called The Fool, an artist collaborative of a Dutch and a Canadian artists who they had met, who made clothing and painted murals and were musicians. They had met them a year before and had started buying clothes from them. I think John had bought some crushed velvet pants from the Fool. And then they invited them to paint. John Lennon had a piano painted by the Fool. They did these large-scale murals, and George Harrison had his country estates, the fireplace, painted. And then they launched the Apple Boutique, where all the garments were made by the Fool. And that actually, the painting of the outside of the building didn't last very long because they never asked permission from the city council, so residents were horrified. The shop itself lasted 8 months. They didn't make a dime, they lost a ton of money. And it was supposed to be an emporium for all arts, not just clothing, but it ended up being really just a clothing store. And I do have an interesting British pathé. Let's see if I can remember how to do this. I wanted to find, where is it? Okay. Can you run the tape, please? Come on.
Sgt. Pepper album, the Beatles formed a partnership known as
This is the
Apple
opening.
Corps. Shortly thereafter came the opening of the ill-fated Apple Boutique. The store provided a wide variety of items, but due to financial losses, the boutique was forced to close its doors within a year.
Another hippie happening in the psychedelic social centre. And the beautiful people of London made their flower power way to Beatles, George and John's with it, Aladdin's Cave. Only they call it Apple. It's a new kind of boutique in Baker Street, catering for specialized tastes.
That's Eric Clapton.
George and John described their new venture as a kind of psychedelic Garden of Eden for lovers of hippie gear with all the trappings of beautiful living. After explaining that, George thought he'd take it easy. He was lucky he could find the chair. So he settled back to listen to the latest kind of shop-warming music as played by the group who designed the store. They call themselves The Fool. They thought it was divine, like everything else in the three-story psychedelic supermarket.
That's Patty Boyd, George Harrison's wife.
Cilla Black was among the top shop warmers. So was Kenneth Tynan. There were lots of others we didn't recognize. Sherlock Holmes used to live in Baker Street. Perhaps he could have identified them. But the Beatles found it all very elementary. That's shop business.
Stone's throw from Orchard Street, it's the Apple, the Beatles' new boutique. To mark the opening, the proud owners gave an apple juice party.
Okay. Can you go back to the slides?
John Lennon and George Harrison.
Thank you. Well, The Fool, as I said, it only lasted 8 months, and it was a total failure financially. In fact, they ended up just giving away the clothes, and there was a stampede 8 months later when they closed doors. And they had actually lost more money to shoplifting than anything else, because friends of the Beatles would show up and just take things. And so it was a financial disaster, however, but it was a very interesting investigation. And interestingly enough, the Beatles went on to have another Apple tailoring investment where they did more menswear. So fashion was important to the biggest pop band in the world. The people responsible for making all the clothes, and they were tended to be hand-painted satins and velvets, crushed velvets, went on, actually moved to America, and two of them, Yoshi Leager and her husband Barry Finch, moved to Los Angeles, where they opened, there they are, up the top there in the hills of Los Angeles, where they opened a boutique called The Chariot, again, sort of tapping into cosmological and tarot motifs. They did a lot of things for pop stars in the time, Linda Ronstadt and people like that. But this was sold at more traditional stores. This was not just weird costumes for stage. This was some of these were sold at Saks Fifth Avenue and Bloomingdale's, among other retail establishments. But you can see their inspiration. This was the label inside this wonderful costume, which was called Cosmic Couture. So again, they're really kind of working these things that really high contrast colors, psychedelic acid, yellows and greens, and also just kind of pumping up the experience of fashion. But the most psychedelic and pretty infamous boutique of all was located on King's Road in London, and it was called Granny Takes a Trip. And that's one of the founders there, Nigel Hayworth, there posing in his vintage. And that's how they actually started out, with vintage fashion. They were a haven for aristocratic bohemians and all the pop stars. Eric Clapton, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix when he was in town, all shopped at Granny Takes a Trip. And it was a very much cool, in-the-know hangout. There's a famous story that Salman Rushdie lived actually upstairs from Granny Takes a Trip when he was a young, unknown writer, and he was rather intimidated. It was also hard to find the door. It was an endless series of art installations where they would change. That was its earliest incarnation, where there actually is a door. But they had these giant murals, some of which celebrated Native American chiefs for a while. Then there was a giant mural of Jean Harlow. And their last incarnation was a half of a 47 Dodge that was exploding out the front of the boutique until the city council said, okay, that's enough. They said, you take that down. So it was a very intimidating place where all the cool people hung out, but Salman Rushdie wanted to go in once. He vowed he was gonna go in, so he saw the Beatles pull up in a limo, and he went down and knocked on the door, and someone actually just opened the door, blew pot smoke in his face, and slammed it again. So I don't think he actually got in the door at Granny Takes a Trip. So it was ultimate cool, and what they sort of prided themselves on was this sort of dandy look, and this is one of the examples of the suits. Crushed velvets, pané velvets, and satins were part of the psychedelic fashion sort of core, because it was not just a visual experience you're going to have through fashion with the lurid colors, it's a textural thing too, is to feel clothes in a different way. So you have so many suits from this era, and they really kind of have their one foot in mod, but one foot in this going somewhere else. And here's the inside label to this suit. A radiating mushroom, so I think you know what trip this granny is going on. Most of the suits were made by John Pierce, who was their resident tailor. He was actually trained on Savile Row, and he actually prided the fact, he said that they were not so well made, and they usually split, and the wearing of them was really tight. These are all post-war kind of skinny, flashy boys wearing these outfits really tight, and they would split at the crotch all the time. He said they just looked like ragged troubadours, but they didn't care. They thought it was really fun. The most classic suit, though, and jacket that Granny Takes a Trip produced is this one called the William Morris jacket. If you were a rock star in the late 60s, you had to have this. There's George Harrison with his version. And this is Noel Redding from the Jimi Hendrix Experience wearing his. It was basically John Pierce went and got, it's William Morris fabric. It is furnishing fabric, bachelor buttons from first printed in 1892, but turned into a very flashy jacket. Even the women's fashion designer, Ossie Clark, had his own version. So did the American actor, Dennis Hopper. It was a very cool jacket, a hip jacket to have. That's Patty Boyd, George Harrison with his wife, Patty Boyd, there on the left. What's interesting about this suit, too, is that it also shows another important influence on psychedelic trippy art, which is looking to the past. And that's one of the signature things that sort of takes this away from mod and sets it on the road to hippie, is that this interest in 19th century art. There's a great quote from John Pierce of Granny saying, we were interested in Art Nouveau. This was the time where the Aubrey Beardsley first retrospective was happening at the V&A. People loved the sinuous lines of the whiplash S-curves of Art Nouveau. It was also the erotica that was sort of embedded in Art Nouveau. And so they start looking backwards, not forwards, like mod with its space-age fashions. And that's something that hippies are going to run with, is this interest in the past and not the future. Here's an example of a clear influence coming from the past. This is a shirt in our collection, not in the Hippie Chic show, but which derives its print from two different Art Nouveau posters. One by an American, where you can see William Bradley did the Victor bicycles here, and you can see that the image, but the motorcycle Comeo comes from a Theophile Steinlen poster. So both of them firmly from the 1890s, become excellent fodder for a man's printed shirt. This looking to the past is a huge chapter of fashion. And what you start to see happening is that real hippies are going to go down to the Salvation Army and they're buying old clothes and they're wearing vintage fashions. And today that doesn't seem like a big deal, but at the time, wearing vintage fashions was a new thing. In the 1950s, if you wore someone's old clothes, you were wearing someone's old clothes. You were clearly poor, or you're not going to want to wear someone's older clothes. In the 1960s, it becomes a fashion statement. It is fun. It made for a totally unique look. They could personalize and come up with their whole collaged outfit. It's maybe part vintage, part ethnic, and it made for a fun, singular look. I've talked to many ex-hippies since then who said, oh, it wasn't just fun for us, it was fun for our friends. It was all part of this joint, sort of group of fun they were having with fashion. So looking to the past is going to be a huge part of the story of hippie styles that's going to percolate up to designers. I show this, there's a woman there at Woodstock. That photograph was taken at Woodstock. And we have to remember this is the era of granny dresses. Hippies, young people are going down and finding these old Edwardian or Victorian dresses and wearing them. She's got her granny glasses even on and an old hat. And of course, I show this Janis Joplin, though she's sitting amidst all these ethnic, Eastern textiles, she happens to be wearing what's thrown over the back of her chair is a fabulous 1890s to 1900 opera coat. It's beautiful vintage embroidered opera coat from the era with probably a very high collar. So she was clearly, she's a style icon herself. She and Jimi Hendrix will show as well, but it was the mixture of all these things, the mixture of ethnographic inspired clothes with vintage fashions, which makes their outfits so fun and so unique. This is an article that appeared in Vogue calling the New Edwardians, really encapsulating what they were seeing on the street, is that all these young people were walking around wearing old Edwardian dresses they found at the junk shops. And the designers quickly responded. You have someone like Gina Frattini there on the left, making this sort of updated baby doll dress. It still kind of has the high waistline of Maud, but she's dropped the length all the way to the floor, and it's all sort of sweet dotted Swiss that's embroidered, very much tapping into this romantic. And that's what it was. Wearing old clothes opened up, it was a way to kind of change your personality or be something else or explore another idea, even temporarily. We have to remember, too, that this was the era in the 60s where you saw this uptick in Renaissance fairs and medieval fairs and this whole sort of reveling in historic dress again. And I love this photograph because it wasn't just for women. The romantic dandy look was huge for men, especially in London. London had a very long tradition in high-end bespoke tailoring, the whole Savile Row scene, and also they created the dandies. Whether it's Beau Brummel from the early 19th century, the ultimate dandy, or even later in the century, Oscar Wilde, who was notorious for his sort of flamboyant dandy looks. But there's a long tradition in London. You may not have seen this here too much maybe in New York, you'd see more sort of Regency dandies, but definitely in London. And I just love this. Patrick Litchfield was a society celebrity photographer in the 60s. And this is his own self-portrait wearing clothing by Mr. Fish, who was a Savile Row trained tailor who opened his own boutique, and it was resplendent with crushed velvet satins and all manner of Regency dandy looks. So I think he carries it well here. I had to note that his real name, of course, he was the 5th Earl of Litchfield, so he was a celebrity and a photographer of upper class, as he was one himself. Unlike David Bailey, the other great photographer of this time, who was very sort of London working class, he was very much of the class he was photographing. But I love his Byron-esque collar, where that really matches his fabulous jacket. And of course, maybe Mick wants to forget this photo now, but he absolutely adopted this romantic look for men. This was at the 1969 concert after Brian Jones had died. They gave a free concert in Hyde Park, and I think Keith Richards is having none of it. But Mick is wearing Mr. Fish. And the funny thing was, the next day in the London Times, they said Mick's dress was being knocked off all over London by girls. But I think he carries it well. We have to remember also that it could be any era that was fair game for designers and hippies to sort of explore. Camelot came out in 1967 and actually inspired a lot of sort of medieval looks. And also the first paperback versions of Lord of the Rings was published then and was very popular among people. So anything medieval could be seen in long, tapering, pointed sleeves or round, low collars and flowing skirts were all sort of medieval or quasi-medieval, as in this dress by Lee Bender for Bus Stop. I don't have an image of the woman who wore it, but she was, actually I do, I think later when we get to retro, she made it to the cover of Rolling Stone's magazine, cover of the Groupie Girl issue. She was making her way through all the pop stars in London at this time when she was wearing this dress and had a grand time. She told me all sorts of great adventures over the phone, but she said, oh, she had a good time with that dress on. I love this. This was the latest edition we put in the Hippie Chic show. It came in right like a month before the show opened, so couldn't make it to the catalog. But it is a chastity belt. So it's a wonderful example of looking backwards and also being very cognizant of the contemporary young woman's ambitions. So the piece that you'll see in the exhibition is more like this one over here, and it's meant to hang low with a big dial right over the belly, which was to hold your birth control pills. So it may be sort of medieval-y, but this girl was not gonna be stupid when she wore her crazy chastity belt. Renaissance styles were also very popular, and this is a whole spread that appeared in Vogue magazine about the Renaissance of costume. I would die to find this coat because it has all these little faces all over it that looks just like a Renaissance tapestry. It's fabulous. If you ever see one floating around, please call me. This is one of my favorite outfits that you'll see in the exhibition by a very interesting, very hippie establishment that was working in San Francisco, called the East-West Musical Instrument Company. And it was actually designed, the founder and designer went to a costume history book and looked at Renaissance fashions because he felt he was everyone at this company was young and in their 20s. They were all sort of cool artists types. It had this weird name because he had tried to make an instrument out of leather completely unsuccessfully. He didn't sell anything. So I think his girlfriend finally said, you got all this leather around, why don't you just make some clothes? So I think one of their first customers was Janis Joplin, who appeared in their apartment with 2 pit bulls, and he had a cat that just had kittens, and he said it was absolute chaos, but she walked out with one of his leather jackets. And so they call this is called the Rennie suit, short for Renaissance. So Norman Studd's designer, had felt like hippies represented the new flower children and that they connected with the flower children of the Renaissance, that he felt like this was a new birth happening in culture, that things, something was wonderful was happening, a new change in ideas. So he really felt like looking to the Renaissance for inspiration for his clothing. These were incredibly popular with pop stars, and I'm showing you John Bonham, the drummer from Led Zeppelin, wearing his version. But they weren't just worn for stage costume, although they're rather flamboyant. They said they were hugely popular. They sold them to all sorts of people, not just performers. But I do love that this was from their 1969 first American tour, the guidebook, the playbook that they had done. And even a designer like Zandra Rhodes, who's still around today. I don't know if you are familiar with Zandra Rhodes. She's identifiable by her magenta hair. And a very interesting singular designer whose premise is really, she was a textile designer by training, so everything is to honor the print that she puts on the fabric. And that's why her dresses tend to have weird shapes, is that she cuts around the print. That's the most important part. But for this series, she actually went to the Victoria and Albert Museum and studied Renaissance English Elizabethan miniatures, and to look at the way they did the cutting and slashing and pinking, and also the smocking that would appear on clothing. And though it has its own Zandra Rhodes flavor, it was clearly inspired by her research in a museum collection with Renaissance clothing. In America, they didn't really look to Edwardian and Victorian styles per se. We had our own things to plumb, and that was the prairie hippie look. This dress did not fall off of the lot of Laura Ingalls Wilder. It actually was sold at a very upscale boutique called Giorgio. I think it's on Rodeo Drive. This is not some crazy costume. And it's definitely tapping what our Americana frontier look, what we would perceive as this, with the gingham, the home-style gingham, but wonderful ruffles and the huge sort of puff sleeves, probably like the late 1890s. And it was this article, as it attests, is that in LA, this was a very strong look, that people embraced our own American version of the granny dress. If you wanted a little more fun, you went for a gypsy look. And if you read Harper's or Vogue during the late 60s, you will see gypsy, gypsy, gypsy this, gypsy that, because it's a little more sassy and a little more exotic, not just the sort of nostalgic sweetness, bucolicness of, Victorian or Edwardian, which, by the way, the company Laura Ashley had parlayed into a $1 billion business. Her whole premise was the granny dress, for which she made a very important business out of. I include this photo because this is a real hippie. This is Laurie Helms, who was married to Chet Helms, who was one of the biggest music promoters, organizers, sort of gurus in San Francisco. He had a lot to do with getting all the bands organized at the Fillmore West and things like that. And this was his wife, who is clearly dressed in her version of a gypsy dress, which was interpreted by designers from ready-to-wear to haute couture. Upper left, you see a dress by Giorgio Santangelo, a New York designer, and on the right, this is Jeffrey Bean. There's a wonderful photograph of Angelica Houston, I didn't include it, of her wearing one as well. So gypsy, anything with ruffles and layers and bright colors and peasant blouses qualified as gypsy in this era of the late 1960s. This is, again, another dress by Giorgio Santangelo, showing, again, the Renaissance influence. He clearly had an affinity as well with the flower children of 15th century Florence, because he styled his dress there on the left, looking at Botticelli's allegory of spring, the primavera there, even to the point of doing three-dimensional flowers festooned around the collar and the shoulders. And it's a very sweet sort of interpretation of that dress. Bill Gibb was a British designer, and his kind of fantasy didn't always sort of was grounded in a certain era. You couldn't always identify which era he's looking at, but he wanted to work the romantic ruffles and elegant drape of earlier styles. Here he's got these sort of batwing sleeves with beautifully, if you can get as close as you can in the gallery to this dress, you can see this endless sort of buttons and overcast stitching he did. Exquisite work, really beautifully done. And he would continue to be one of the most sort of fantasy-driven artists of this era, designers. Fantasy, looking backwards for fantasy, could incorporate the sort of sweet, bucolic, Edwardian and Victorian look, but if you wanted a really cheekier, sort of edgier look, you'd go for retro styles. And when I say retro, I'm meaning more 20s and 30s Art Deco, or even the 1940s. Again, films mirrored this interest in looking to the past. That's Bonnie and Clyde there, which came out, I think, in 1967. And in looking, young people were going down to the vintage stores and buying these old dresses, these crepe-back satin bias-cut dresses from the 20s and 30s, or flapper dresses, and wearing them in a variety of ways. And designers picked up on it as well. Here's just a photo of real hippies from Rags magazine, which was an avant-garde fashion magazine put out in New York, showing, here's Tom and his gang wearing a variety of clothing they found at Salvation Army and vintage places. Some here on the right, she's wearing a sort of a 1920s flapper dress. The seated woman is wearing something that looks much more 1930s in both of them, but even more romantic Victorian here with the white dress at the front. And she's wearing a flapper dress. It's hard to see. It's not a great photograph, but she's wearing a beaded flapper dress from the 20s. So they're all the fun of kind of putting together, but she's wearing it with sort of a Che Guevara beanie there. As part of the fun of putting it together in some collaged ensemble. Designers, my favorite among them being Ossie Clark, really tapped into not only the prints and the silhouettes, but some of the techniques that were popular in the 1920s and 30s. This is a dress where he's actually included bias cutting, which was sort of a signature aspect of early 30s, where you turn the fabric on the bias so it drapes more snugly and sort of liquidy over the body. He was just great at doing very feminine retro-style dresses. He's photographed there with his wife, Celia Birtwell, who he collaborated with. She was a textile designer and did the print. And it was the print, this sort of geometric shapes, again, looks to the 1920s and 30s, and was called her plastic buildings from the Cubist collection. So together, they're working together to update and do a contemporary take on Art Deco styles. The man who revived menswear in this time was a guy named Tommy Nutter. He basically did this he saved Savile Row. Because young people at this time, if you said to go and get a suit from Savile Row, they'd be like, why do I want to dress like my grandfather? They're thinking elegant flannel, loose-cut flannel suits, gray flannel. Tommy Nutter was trained on Savile Row, but then he tapped into this youth culture and this exciting new styles. He looked to the past as well. This is him actually here in both photos, and he loved the looks of the 1920s with its super wide Oxford bags, they called them, and his snappy brogues. And he kind of blew out the proportions. He made the lapels really wide. He put piping on it. He put clashing window pane checks, all of which said to young people, much more fun, much more updated, more youthful look, although exquisitely made, very much Savile Row quality, but for a younger generation. And there on the right, you can see the wide, this is late 60s, this is probably 70, 71, but again, puffing out the sleeves, wide lapels, and he's even got little platform shoes on his brogues. This photograph shows Mick Jagger on his wedding day with Bianca Jagger. She is barely wearing Yves Saint Laurent, but he's wearing Tommy Nutter. So when they were young and had no money, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones all went to Granny Takes a Trip. When they had money, they went to Tommy Nutter. They finally moved on up to high-quality, custom-made, bespoke tailoring. I don't know why she didn't wear Tommy Nutter either, but anyways, she's barely wearing anything. And I'm sure that's why you married her, because she looks great. One of the other signature retro looks would be found at an important boutique called Biba. I don't know if anyone ever experienced Biba in their youth. Whereas Ossie Clark was still rather expensive, Biba was retro looks for the masses. And it was started by Barbara Holonicki, and in a series, first actually mail order catalogs, were how she got her vision, her fashion vision out. But then it moved to a series of stores and eventually to the big Biba store. But what their forte was cheeky, super fashionable, trendy stuff, kind of like the H&M of their era. This is an image from their catalog, and young people who received the mail order catalog clearly knew it was counterculture and very much a drug culture fashion for young people. They were rather notorious too in their exclusivity, not by price, because it was very affordable, but because their clothes were tiny. The arm size were cut super high. Their target audience was teenagers and early 20s. So if you were lucky enough to be that small, you could wear some really super trendy things. I mean, they had some of the most interesting fashion photographers working on their mail order catalogs, but they all feature saucy, very young, very skinny girls looking rather knowingly, sort of innocent yet not innocent in these photographs. And look how tiny her shoulders are. I mean, this is really skinny fashion. Biba loved the retro look, and their most clear expression of this was the store that they created, their last incarnation. They had actually bought the Tom and Derry's department store building, and it was a glorious Art Deco building from the 30s that had closed and been abandoned, really, and they renovated it, all 7 floors. Even the Rainbow Room at the top was extraordinary, and they returned it to this wonderful blend of a little bit contemporary, but mainly a retro look with all the mirrors. In fact, it was reviewed by Kennedy Fraser, one of the fashion commenters, critics, whose work appeared in The New Yorker, and she was there at the opening, and she wrote of Biba, she said, "The vivid images of Busby Berkeley sequin courses fanning out kaleidoscopically from behind Biba's mirrored islands of display, or of Fred Astaire and Miss Rogers whirling down the aisles, attest to its stimulus. Biba is the only department store in the world daring enough to offer us life, spoof, and romance, too." I mean, it was really one of the first concept buildings where you had floor-to-ceiling, this experience of fashion. And it was a place to go and just spend hours and hanging out. And they had lots of couches for boyfriends and husbands to sit around and wait for you as you went through this. And they even actually expanded to home furnishings and dog food in some kind. Unfortunately, it was fiscally a failure. They were bought out by another company, and for all accounts, it was one of the most extraordinary shopping experiences one could get, but it was very brief, and they ended up closing doors, I think, within a year. If you didn't like the 30s look, there was also the 40s look, which was, again, a little bit more campy, and that's something that's going to be part of the dialogue of the early 70s, a sort of cheeky, campy look. People generally credit Yves Saint Laurent with doing it, but other designers were doing it too. Ossie Clark about the same time, and Biba as well, liked the 40s. So as opposed to the 20s and 30s, you suddenly start seeing that wartime look of big shoulder pads, sweetheart necklines, shorter skirts, platform wedgie shoes. And this appears in Vogue. Yeah, the wedgies are back. And this is Yves Saint Laurent Rive Gauche from 1970, British Vogue, showing a classic 40s look being put out by Yves Saint Laurent. He actually did a whole collection called Collection 40. It was vilified by the fashion press. They hated it. They absolutely hated it. Probably because of the notorious Chubby, this jacket there on the far left. It was green dyed fox fur. You can see all the sort of aspects of the 40s, the shoulder lines, the sweetheart necklines, the knee length. In response to the Collection 40, I mean, all the Paris press hated it. You have to remember that in 1970, World War II was not that far in their past, and they didn't like anything. No one wanted to even think about Paris during occupation or their collaboration with the Nazis. That was really like never going to be a subject that's good and for fashion to explore. So there was that resistance, and also they just really didn't like it. In the American press, it had mixed reviews. Mostly bad, though. Eugenia Shepard wrote for the New York Post and called it the ugliest show in town. And Bernardine Morris called it actually Styles for the Demi-Monde, or to put another name on it, it was the Streetwalkers 40, and that's really where the Chubby came in. It was the most vilified piece in the show because it looked like hooker chic, and people didn't like it. Interestingly enough, it's gone on to be one of his most important collections and one of his most popular objects. And this was a version he did here on the right for his Rive Gauche, his boutique line, and but out of feathers, not the fox fur. But here's Ossie Clark doing a little cute 40s dress. He took that same fabric that his wife printed and did it in yellow, but then turned it into the cute little sweetheart neckline with a bow and little puff sleeves. Oops, I thought I had another one there. And that's actually her original sketch of the fabric. Instead of fantasy, one of the huge influences that hippies were going to also look at were ethnographic art and cultures non-Western cultures are going to become a huge influence on fashion. Of course, I just had to put in Jimi Hendrix because he is actually the coolest guy in the world. One of the dapperest, coolest dressers you'll ever find. And he is head to toe in non-Western textiles and epitomizes the sort of West Coast ethnic style. He's got a kimono on. I think that's a Japanese painted kimono. And he's got a Chinese embroidered shawl over his lap. And he's sitting in a chair covered by, I think at the back I see Indian embroidered fabrics. So he is everything that is ethnographic and ethnic in his style. But it was a huge influence for many reasons. This is in the 60s, young people were starting to travel the world in greater numbers, started the Peace Corps. People, Americans and Europeans are all over places where we can't go anymore, like Afghanistan and other, exploring very remote parts of the world, bringing things back and enjoying this experiment and dipping their toes into all these other cultures. Real hardcore hippies, the back to nature hippies, truly ideologically felt that they had an affinity towards primitive cultures, that they lived a more pure life, more connected with nature, and that they just lived a much better way. So you have that whole idea of meaningfulness, and that in adopting costume, it made you sort of live a better life. For other people, it's just fashion. So you start to get real trends. And of course, here's this image again of Janis Joplin with a mix of clothing. The real first trend came from the Beatles when they went to India in '68 to study transcendental meditation. And the result was that anything Indian, printed, cottons, this is a photograph taken at Woodstock, and he's wearing basically a like a printed cotton hanging, a bedspread, turned into a kaftan. And he's wonderful. I love he's carrying 4 packs of cigarettes. But this is Arnold Scazi. He's so not a hippie, custom New York designer, but he is clearly aware that Indian textiles and Indian clothing is a new trend. And he made this outfit for Barbra Streisand in 1969. There she is wearing it at a charity event. This is Jenny Holzer, Society New Yorker, who turned her whole living room into Indian textiles and is wearing actually a Turkish kaftan. These two are by Thea Porter, who we call the queen of ethnic bohemian chic. She owned a London boutique, and she actually grew up in the Middle East. Her parents were missionaries, and she married someone in the foreign service and lived in Beirut and Damascus. So her heart was really in textiles of the East. And so she started a business where she imported them for furnishing fabrics, then started taking those fabrics and making them into clothes. And her shop on Greek Street became a mecca for all the bohemian aristocrats who hung out there. And here are 2 that are made out of Gujarati fabric, silks from India, turned into one like a little peasant dress, and this one a kaftan, which is again a non-Western shape. That kind of long, untailored garment comes from the East and is associated with Islamic countries in North Africa and Morocco and places like that. And of course, this is a great photograph of Talitha and John Paul Getty Jr. at their their Marrakesh home, wearing kaftans. Even Keith Richards in his autobiography talks about wearing a kaftan when he was in Morocco. So everyone sort of embraced this look, even men. Although for men, I love this photograph. This is Mr. Fish again, as a daring man indeed who can wear that look. For women, it was actually mainstream fashion. You could wear it out as an evening dress. Men tended to wear it as lounging outfits. It was just a little bit too wild, I think, for most men. So you could wear it as a smoking or a lounging outfit. But he's fabulous. Check those mutton chops out. This is, again, Thea Porter in one of her examples where she took, this fabric comes from Iraq, from the Marsh people. This is an indigenous group it's from a gigantic wool embroidered hanging that she chopped up and reformed into a very luxurious coat with fur collar and cuffs. Unfortunately, I think the tribes of the Marsh area no longer exist post-Saddam Hussein. He pretty much drained the marsh and killed them off. But it's an extraordinary example of her taking found ethnographic textiles and making them into fashion. And that's actually how it appeared in British Vogue from 1969. You could go further afield, looking towards the shaggy Afghani vests that were hugely popular. It's hard, it's a little cut off, but it said the beauty of the nomad look. And that was a look. And any rock star or fan would wear this shaggy sheepskin vest, and that's Keith Richards wearing that in 1968. Native American culture, though, was one of the lasting sort of indigenous, non-Western, or indigenous sort of primitive culture influences on fashion. And it was an era that was resplendent with anything buckskin, fringe, suede, or headbands. There was some comment in the New York Times that if they saw one more debutante walking down Fifth Avenue wearing knee-high buckskins and fringe, they were just going to faint. But this is another East-West Musical Instruments jacket showing the taste for this Native American look, because this was, we have to remember, the start of the American Indian movement in 1968 in Minnesota. And many people felt very strongly supportive of the plight of Native Americans, and by adopting the fashion, many ideological people felt they were, sort of connecting with these people. Others, it was strictly fashion. Of course, there's Jimi Hendrix wearing his fringe at Woodstock, and these two, it even went, the Native American look went to England. These two are, this was taken, I think, in St. Ives or Cornwall, looking very fringy. And the New York designer, Giorgio Santangelo, did a whole collection based on the natives of America. And this is how Cher, and we know Cher was 0.0000% Cherokee, I think. She definitely worked it a lot, but she was photographed by Avedon wearing Giorgio Santangelo's squaw dress, terrible name, but if in 1969. But even further south, cultures of Mexico, Central America, and South America. And this is actually a Paris designer, I think it's Lanvin or Givenchy, who did this sort of Peruvian look as early as 1967, and the craze for ponchos. Here in New York, worn as skirts, not really over the upper part of the body, but dropped to the waist, which made for a really fun trend in 1970 New York. The last section, and I know I'll speed along because I know I'm probably taking too much time, because I want to also invite questions if you have any, but crafting. This was the great DIY era. This was very much connected to the interest in non-Western cultures, because many of these traditions that revived were connected with historic traditional textile arts. Tie-dye, known as shibori, also has been explored in West Africa for ages. So a lot of these textile trends were really suddenly becoming much more ripe for exploration in the late 60s. I mean, hippies, part of their anti-consumerism was to make their own clothes. And the fun of that was also that they could personalize them and make them totally unique. They could either embroider them, patch them, paint them, anything. And in fact, this was an article that appeared in Rags Magazine, How to Paint Old Shoes. So if they weren't making them from scratch, they could take old clothes and modify them, which was so much conforming to their, sort of self-sufficiency ideals in this time. This was the tie-dye era, which we kind of connect so much with the West Coast, but it was really everywhere. As this guy here who was photographed in Central Park here, he's looking a little dazed, but he's got his tie-dye t-shirt there, and a photograph that appeared in Time magazine of hippies doing, amidst tie-dye, doing other things. And of course, notice he's wearing fringe as well, a fringe jacket. But tie-dye was not just for Haight-Ashbury or for hippies. Even a designer like Halston, whose clientele was Liza Minnelli and the Cat Pack, any Upper East Side New Yorker socialites, was fascinated with tie-dye. He did it in a very artful way. He made this pantsuit with the help of two tie-dye artists in New York, the Richardsons, and a company they called Uptide, but it's beautiful silk velvet. And he did in 1969, he explored tie-dye endlessly. And that's a wonderful image of one of his tie-dyes that appeared in Vogue, set against, it's not the Blue Mosque, but it's a provincial mosque in Iran. But this is, you wouldn't believe this, but this is Halston's first salon in New York, in Manhattan. We think of him as the king of minimalism, and he certainly became that by the 70s. Mr. Disco and beautiful streamlined knits, Studio 54 guy. But in 1969, he was totally ethnographic, ethnic hippie. This was he had the whole thing done by Dongia Company in faux batik, and it filled with Moroccan inlaid furniture. So it was like going to a souk to go to Halston's. Within a few years, he stripped it all out and it was all white. He had moved on. But among the many techniques that we know and we experienced, the revivals of patchwork, quilting, knitting, crochet, macrame. Remember, there was a really hugely important book, Virginia Harvey's The Art of Macrame, 1967, which started this huge trend in macrame plant hangers, which maybe some of you still I know my mom still has all hers. Patchwork was also, it was so popular it made it to Time magazine in 1969 on a cover. And this was a hippie doing what they did. They went and bought old quilts at junk shops and turned them into clothes. And they weren't when they started, people followed. And even get someone like the designer Gloria Vanderbilt, this is a society woman in New York. Not only is she wearing, what she and her gang would do was take the old quilts out of their closet and bring them to Adolfo, and Adolfo would modify them into beautiful dresses. But she had her whole house done in patchwork. And this was a double-page spread from Vogue from 1969. I think that would just be a little too much for me. I don't think I can handle it. But you might say this is the most hippie chicest piece in the exhibition. You will see. It is Yves Saint Laurent, Haute Couture, Fall-Winter 1969. He did not invent patchwork, but he clearly was aware of this trend, this street trend going on among hippies. You have to remember that Yves Saint Laurent was about 30-something years old. He's still a young man, and though he's the head creative director of a very, haute couture, a house, and all of that hand craftsmanship and that tradition that encompasses, he was still aware of young people and their interests and what they were doing in the whole boutique scene. So he makes his own patchwork dress. He works with one of the great embroideresses, Madame André Bresson in Paris, and there's over 250 pieces of fabric in here, all hand-stitched. It's gorgeous. It is the most expensive faux poverty patchwork you'll ever see. And it looks, and I think he did a great job. It looks like a stained glass window or a mosaic of some kind. You could also embroider. Hippies were embroidering their clothing. I love this one on the left. It's completely covered. But the self-expression avenues that embroidering your clothes was just incredibly rich. And of course, you definitely wanted to do your jeans. And you could also paint leather tooling. We've sort of forgotten that, but I even remember going up to the beach, and there'd always be some leather place, where you'd buy hair bobs and things like that. And it was such an important part, leather crafting in this era. And this artist, Charlotte Vasquez, took it even further. She actually went to Mexico and worked with artists there. She had the leather, she patchworked the leather, and then these artists were actually connected with the ceramic. I think you can clearly see that their primary industry is ceramics, painting for ceramics. But they did all the painting on her leather patchwork pieces, and it's really a great chic, hippie look. And knitting, crochet, this was from an article from Rags Magazine, this guy on the right saying, knitting is for both men and women, and it's the new art knitting, it's the new era. And we're still living with this revival today. These crafts that were revived, quilting and knitting and are still very rich today. And I think this interest in making and in the 1960s is a very important thing we shouldn't forget. There's a hippie there on the left wearing her sort of crocheted Afghan around her. And then here on the right is Louis Ferre doing it on Ferrod's in Paris, Haute Couture, worn by Penelope Tree. And the last image I'll show you is, again, another piece by East West Musical Instrument Company, because I just think they're such a fun company. Norman, in thinking about doing this jacket, he said, how can I make a bird into a jacket? I mean, his whole approach was very organic and very different. out of the box. Since having the show Hippie Chic, I've been contacted by several interesting people, and one of them is a professor who's writing a book on hippie economics. Because so many of the people in this era who didn't want to follow tradition and wanted to do things differently, like Norman Stubbs, are now running companies that are hugely important because they refused to sort of think in the box and pursued avenues towards business solutions and to design and other issues like that, that really took them outside of, and became today very successful because I think they approached design issues in a new way. And I think that this is one of the best jackets that East West did. It was, by the way, totally ripped off by Nicolas Guesquier at Balenciaga in 2005. And he didn't think anyone would notice. But this is rather, East West Musical Instruments stuff is cultish now. There are collectors all over the world who find these really interesting. And he got busted big time because he copied it line for line. He didn't just say it was inspirational, he just did a complete replica of it. So, and that's their image. These are actually 2 employees. It was a funky place. Everybody was in their 20s. They had like 3-day work weeks, things like that. It was a little 3 or 4 day work weeks and tended, I think, more pot breaks than coffee breaks. And they also were very cool about, like, if people just wanted to take off to Mexico, that's great, just come back whenever you're ready. Like they had a rotating sort of group of employees. But what's cool about East West is that they're a really tight group. These people who worked there are still connected today. It was an experience and a wonderful place, apparently, to work, and they're very special. So I end with that, and with some of the messages of hippie is that I think a lot of what we achieved in fashion then are still with us. I mean, this freedom to dress however you want, we're very familiar with that today. We can tap any look, and there's multiple looks going on. People can be goth one day and whatever vintage the next. I think a lot of the ability and the freedom to do that was really the foot was wedged in the door by the hippies, and I think that's something we should acknowledge, that this great personal expression is really rooted in this time. Well, thank you very much for coming. If there are no questions, great.